literature by era, specifically the eras in England since 1790. From that period in 1790 up until roughly the present day, there were three major eras. The first of these three was the Romantic era. The second of these literary eras in England was known as the Victorian era. And the third and final literary era of England is what is known as the Modern era. These three eras, although sharing many characteristics, were also very different. This is appropriate, as all three eras reflected very different points in England's history. The lines between these eras are, in fact, generally drawn by historical events. Because these events dramatically changed the worldview of the citizens in the country, that literature reflects the same dramatic change. The first of the three major literary periods is the Romantic era. This era has several proposed starting dates. One of these is the French Revolution, which fits with the Romantic ideals of value in the common people and tying politics to art. Another commonly proposed date is the publication of William Wordsworth, pictured here's, Lyrical Ballads. This piece is considered the capstone of the Romantic era in that it defines many of the era's goals and philosophies in a way that was widely held by a lot of other people. The Romantics were especially fascinated by the common man and the child. They believed that these people, living out in the country and working as laborers, lived a purer existence than those corrupted by urban life. They were also fascinated by the ideas of the sublime and the supernatural, which led to some interesting ideas about spirituality during the Romantic era that would be considered fairly scandalous both before and after. The Romantics also put a lot of emphasis on the individual. They believed that emotion and memory were key paths to truth, as well as imagination, which they held in high regard. Probably due to this emphasis on the imagination, the Romantics had such a fascination with setting their stories in places far away or in times long ago, such as Greece and Rome. The final truly significant characteristic of the Romantics was their idolization of nature. They held nature in very, very high regard and believed it allowed humans to think, feel, and understand the world around them more deeply. A good example of the character of the Romantic era is the long poem 1811, which was written by poet Anna Barbauld, who is pictured here. The poem is largely a very political statement, which speaks on English imperialism, as well as a history of culture and empire in the world. Many of the themes in this poem overlap with characteristics of the Romantic era. For example, connecting the political and the artistic was very common in the Romantic era. Much of the entire poem is political, but it's especially obvious in the first stanza, when Barbauld talks about how Britain bends her ear, feeds the fierce strife, the alternate hope and fear, bravely though vainly dares to strive with fates. It also describes nature in a way that is very characteristic of the Romantic era. Throughout the poem, she uses natural things as boundaries for global locations, but especially in the second stanza, she speaks of nature being bounteous and vain, with frantic man at strife, glad nature pours the means, the joys of life. Barbauld speaks about nature as something which man has corrupted to some degree, but is in itself beautiful, and a form towards which man should strive. Throughout the poem, Barbauld also plays with the idea of memory, not only of an individual, but also of cultures and groups of people, and even world memory, as in, will the world remember these cultures after they're gone, after what she refers to as the genius which brings civilization has passed on to other parts of the land, as she says it inevitably will. This mobile genius concept also allows Barbauld to speak on foreign lands and ancient cultures in a way she couldn't otherwise, as there are entire stanzas dedicated to jumping between Egypt and ancient Greece and Rome, in a way that the Romantic period really enjoyed to look at. Although this poem is more political than the archetypical Wordsworth poem that would characterize the Romantic era, much of the Romantic era was in fact very political, and so this Barbauld poem fits the tone of many Romantic pieces very well, in the entire era. The second of these three major eras was the Victorian era. Victorians are referred to often as the first age that was consciously modern. They experienced both an information explosion and a sudden increase in technology in a way that dramatically changed their lifestyle very, very quickly. Perhaps because of this, the Victorians questioned pretty much everything, especially organized religion, which, to be fair, was fairly corrupt at the time in the Anglican Church. Victorian writing often dealt with more urban and social issues, especially as the cities were thriving during this period. Many of the social issues that were addressed often were things like class, imperialism, industrialization and charity, and women's rights. Seeing these social issues addressed often in a very moralizing way was very common in the Victorian era. Victorians were questioning almost everything and had almost boundless energy. But despite all their questions, the Victorians, unlike the later modernists, still expected to find answers.
One piece characteristic of this era was written by Thomas Carlyle. It's called The Gospel of Mammonism, and specifically the section about the Irish widow. In his essay, Carlyle explores people's relations to each other and their duty to their fellow man. The essay specifically describes a widow who, upon not receiving charity, contracts typhoid fever and dies, taking out many other people with her, who also die of typhoid fever. The piece, much like many other Victorian pieces, tries to address how urbanization and industrialization, and especially the large sudden increase in technology, affects the people living in these cities, and their relationships to pretty much everything else. This particular essay speaks especially about charity, and people's duty to each other, even in a city. It also addresses the lack of faith, and especially faith in organized religion, that was rampant in the Victorian period, when he says that the people must find a soul if they even want to kill the poor widow. The moralizing tone of this piece is also very common in the Victorian era. Many Victorian pieces were written with a purpose, and in this case in particular, it was to convince people that socially, this was not an appropriate thing to do. This piece matches the themes of the Victorian era with prevalent themes of urban living, change, and activism. The third and final British literary period since 1790 is modernism. The modern era is known as the age of skepticism or of doubt and disillusionment. These adjectives were largely the result of World War I changing how people thought of the world in many, many cases. Widespread death and destruction of World War I made it hard for people to accept that the world was the way it had been before. Probably because of this disillusionment with the old ways, the modern writers were very interested with experimenting with form and style. This often resulted in works that were very non-linear and fragmented, especially in poetry. In addition to this, there was a lot of focus on self-examination in the individual psyche, which emerged roughly with Freud. This was especially prevalent in the modern novels, which often followed a stream of consciousness type structure. One poem very characteristic of modernism is called Hap, which was written by Mr. Thomas Hardy, who you see here with the fabulous mustache. In the title of the poem, Hap is used to mean chance. This title expresses the narrator's frustration that everything in life is nothing more than random occurrence. This poem, much like many others during the modern era, carries a heavy tone of disillusionment and anger as well, which is also common, especially in the World War I poem. The speaker is very frustrated with his life. He is looking for comfort, but finding none, which was also very common with the modernists, who, unlike the Victorians, didn't necessarily believe that there were any answers to all these questions and all this violence. The speaker in Hap rejects many traditional beliefs, including religion. In the poem, the speaker says that if there was a God who was dealing out this trouble, he could bear it. But there is not, and there is not any greater force that cares. This also rejects the traditional ideas about justice. The poem also begins to experiment with traditional structure, including using a rhyme scheme that is irregular, and adds to the general feelings of confusion and chaos conveyed by the poem. It thematically feels very much like a modern poem. It carries the same tones of disillusionment and rejection of the traditional, which hadn't worked out for them. All three of the eras since 1790 in British literature largely reflected the events surrounding them. And by looking at individual works, it is often easy to understand the characteristics of the entire period. I hope this presentation was at least a little helpful in understanding the three eras of British literature since 1790.